The Alberta government has announced a new plan to combat rural crime. To talk more about it is the Alberta correspondent of the National Post, Tyler Dawson. He joins me now via Skype from Edmonton. Tyler, the new plan involves integrating provincial peace officers and strengthening owners' property rights. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so they've picked up a little bit on something that Saskatchewan did a while back, and that is to sort of expand the mandate and the number of provincial law enforcement officers, peace officers who are able to help out. In this case, the RCMP cover such a vast territory in rural Alberta. As everyone sort of knows who's been following this over the last couple of years, there are, long wait times, slow response times, simply because there just aren't that many RCMP officers and they cover a lot of ground. So what this does is there's going to be 400 new peace officers, conservation officers, fish and wildlife, that those sort of law enforcement people who will be trained up on how to respond to calls and sort of work alongside the RCMP in a more robust capacity, perhaps. And then, as you say, the other side of this is the homeowner's liability stuff. So this is following a little bit of things that we talked about a couple weeks ago with the occupation of that turkey barn on a Hutterite farm, I believe it was. So there's going to be, more fines for breaking onto property and things like that. I think $20,000, $25,000 for an individual, up to $200,000 for an organization. And the other thing, which is really interesting, is there is going to be a exemption from liability for homeowners. So basically what that means is a homeowner cannot be liable for something they've done while protecting their property if the person who later sues them was committing a crime or is believed to have been committing a crime, which is a bit of a roundabout explanation. And, this is not obviously a blank check to do whatever you want to someone who comes on your property, but it does sort of stem from the other thing we talked about recently, which was Edward Maurice being sued by the fellow who'd been hit by a ricocheted bullet on his property near Okotoks.
Now, the new plan to combat rural crime also includes cracking down on metal theft, like copper.
Yeah, isn't that an interesting one, eh? The idea that metal thievery is a real scourge on Alberta, I think, is maybe not something that people think about very often. But indeed, there will be ID requirements and more robust accounting and whatnot for metal theft. And anyone who's, I guess, worked in a warehouse or any sort of facility that has scrap metal kicking around will have experienced this at some point. So they are trying to crack down on that. And the government called it a significant public safety issue. So maybe not a victimless crime. I think people could easily think of it as such. And so yeah, that's the other part of it. And the final part of it, I suppose, is there's going to be a community impact statement in sentencing of criminal trials. So everyone knows we have a victim impact statement. Well, now the community is going to be able to input their views on the matter.
Tyler, the UCP government visited many towns and cities recently across the province, including here in Lethbridge, I know at Edmonton as well, where you are, asking for public input into the supervised safe consumption sites. Now, the panel is looking at the social and economic impact of Alberta's existing sites. At this point, funding is up in the air after March 31st. What are you hearing?
Yeah, that's right. So the idea is that the budget is being carefully looked at, funding commitments are being carefully looked at. And so the operations of these injection sites, which have seen about 400,000 people, I think, all total, or 400,000 visits, this may be more accurate over the last, since they opened, they will not know whether or not their funding is going to continue until early next year. So obviously there's the political back and forth of the NDP saying, oh, there's no way, these sites need more time to work on their budgets, this is unacceptable. And then obviously the government saying that this is, everything has to be looked at if the government's going to rein in its spending. Now, this also happened in Ontario, actually, after Doug Ford took over his Progressive Conservatives in June of 2018. And what happened in some of those instances when the province cut off funding was the city stepped in. That had certainly been discussed in Ottawa at that point. So, there is the possibility that funding will be found for these groups. It just might not be from a provincial mechanism, and that'll shake out at some point in the new year, I suppose.
Premier Jason Kenney was in Mexico recently to drum up investment for our province. He was discussing immigration reforms, red tape, corporate tax cuts. Was it money well spent, and how was his tan looking?
Well, I can't imagine he got too much time on the beach, and we didn't get a chance to ask him this week because he ended up canceling his media availability on it. But indeed, he was there, giving his sort of regular rundown on the sort of Make Alberta Open for Business stuff that he's been working on. And as you said, that includes fast tracking some accreditation for new immigrants. That includes reducing red tape, the corporate tax cut that's going down from 12 to 8 over the next few years. All of these things are part of this job creation strategy the UCP has. And Jason Kenney has been traveling to a number of places to pitch this. So he was in Mexico, as you said. He was out on the East Coast of the United States several weeks ago during the election. Money well spent. I think time will tell to some extent. I do hope he got a day or two off though, but I doubt it. I do know he flew in on the red eye overnight, Friday into Saturday. So doesn't sound too relaxing to me.
Now, and Canada pulling out with the energy sector here, going down to the United States, Husky laying off hundreds of workers in Calgary. Has the UCP government talked about possibly diversifying our economy, not relying so much on oil and gas, even though it's a big part of our economy, not just in Alberta, but the country?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a mixed bag in that one. I think everyone agrees that the diversification of the economy is going to be important. And so this was a bit of a bone of contention for some groups during the budget. Now, the UCP, as I mentioned, is doing this job creation tax cut, they're calling it, where they're reducing corporate taxes to some of the most competitive in North America, which a lot of economics suggests that's a good idea. But you did have some targeted tax credits, for example, to small craft breweries and to tech industry firms, things like that. So some of those tax credits, those targeted diversification tax credits that came in under the NDP, are being eliminated in favor of this broader sort of tax reform, tax break for corporations. So I think it's probably safe to say this is not as targeted and as, directed policy-oriented response that it was under the NDP because you don't have some of these things continuing. But there's no doubt that drumming up more trade, drumming up more investment, new businesses, all that kind of stuff is on the UCP agenda. I think they're just going about it in a more broader-based sort of way.
Now, here's an interesting story. Jason Nixon's CARIBOU plan has been unveiled. There are 3 task forces across the province that are going to come up with a solution to balance the caribou population versus the needs of the industry. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, sometimes it's a little bit of fun and games. It's not all doom and gloom in economics. So that's the gist of it. Where you're going to have a caribou plan. So caribou at one point roamed this entire province, more or less, large portions of it at any rate, and they have been sort of slowly dying out. There's about 15 herds left, I believe. Not very many of them are growing. And this is basically just sort of human encroachment on their territory from what I've read about it. And so the idea is that these task forces are going to look through sort of their traditional travel routes and things like that to look at the balance between untouched nature and industry and try and come up with a way to sort of protect them while maintaining the needs of industry as well in these areas. So, this has been very much an ongoing topic of discussion. The NDP had looked into it. Blues Parks Canada has its own strategy for caribou in the parks, so it's very much on folks' radar. But and it just also goes to show that governments don't just get to do things like wage negotiations and tax cuts. They've also got to worry about wildlife.
The province has appointed a whole new panel to look at mental health and addictions. This goes back to a little bit of the discussion with the SCS. The idea is to steer people away from harm reduction and towards something called recovery-oriented continuum of care. What is that all about?
It's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? The idea is that this is supposed to be, they would prefer to see, I should say, a treatment-oriented system. So Anywhere along the path of your life when you decide you want to seek treatment for this addiction, ideally help will be there for you. As pretty much everyone knows, the mental health system is, struggling under the weight of addictions issues, drug abuse, and regular sort of clinical mental health issues. So this panel will be looking at that as a way to help folks. Now, the NDP had done similar work that was almost exclusively, as you mentioned, about harm reduction, supervised injection sites, and things like that. This government has a bit of a reorientation in its philosophy.
Now, the new budget has been out for quite some time, and the unions, they're still pretty angry with the cuts coming.
They are indeed. When is a labor union ever truly happy, though? I suppose they exist in some ways to be cranky about these things. But yeah, there was big meetings this week in Calgary from sort of the three major unions. For quite some time, they were looking at sort of wage stabilization over the next few years. No raises, I should say. Pardon me. But no cut either. And now they are looking at cuts between sort of 2 and 5%. So it is anyone's guess where exactly this is going to go. But they are, looking quite prepared for a fight, whether that is courts, whether that is, Albertans with slightly longer memories will recall striking nurses and things like that. So it could go sort of any direction at this point, but certainly they are not happy about it, and they are ready to throw down. It's just a question of
And
when.
the provincial budget numbers are starting a bit of a trickle-down effect down to the municipalities. Some are looking at property tax increases to make up for revenue shortfall.
Yeah, so basically the major cities are looking at a decent chunk less money coming in. And Edmonton, for example, committed to 2.5% or so property tax increase. They didn't want to go above that. And without that money coming down from the province, they're having to look at ways to save that money, rein back spending, that's delay infrastructure. So it's a bit of a rough time for municipalities, and I think in large part we see this all over the country every time this happens, that municipalities just don't have a lot of tax power. They need to raise their money from property taxes. They can't level a sales tax or an income tax beyond some tourism things. Which I'm not advocating for more taxes here, but it does put municipalities in a bit of a hard place when they are saying, well, we have these things we want done, we have these things voters want done, but that money isn't necessarily available to them.
Nobody said tightening the belt would be easy, right? Anne McClellan was recently tapped to be a Western envoy to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, since he doesn't have any representation, any MPs in either Alberta or Saskatchewan.
That's right. So I don't know if this will be enough to, quiet some of the angry people, but giving him the benefit of the doubt, whether or not he deserves it is another question. He is at least appointing someone who lives out here, who knows a little bit about it, who was at one point and is well regarded in Edmonton. So hopefully he will get some of that perspective that has maybe been lacking. I think certainly a critic would say perhaps the representation should come from someone who was more recently elected by Albertans, who is more in line with the current politics out here. I mean, I've talked about it a few times in the last couple days, saying Brad Wall's technically available, Brian Jean's available. These are guys who maybe have a little better finger on the pulse. And the other thing is that Edmonton is insulated in many, many ways from a lot of the trouble of the last few years. I mean, the major layoffs, the empty office towers, these are in Calgary. A lot of the rural businesses and service industry, things like that. Edmonton was insulated from that in a lot of ways because of the government jobs. So the picture is a little different here, I think, to some extent. And I certainly think it would be fair to be a little bit concerned about what Anne McClellan sees when she looks out her window, as opposed to what perhaps you see in Lethbridge and what people see elsewhere in the province.
Tyler, let's talk federal politics for just a moment here. Tory leader Andrew Scheer had a caucus meeting recently. Do we know at this point what was discussed?
Not especially, but we do know that he was in for the fight of his life. It's an odd thing, right? Because when media goes to all these conservative politicians and say, "What are you thinking? Do you support Scheer? Or are you going to, try and see him removed?" They all tend to say they support him and they stand behind the leader, and there's this show of solidarity. And then they get behind closed doors, and it's sort of anyone's guess what'll happen. So I think we'll start to see a little bit of that trickle out in the coming days to get a real sense of just how divided this caucus is. I think he could probably survive this sort of thing with the confidence of his caucus. Perhaps if some staff were jettisoned, some new strategists brought aboard, things like that. Clearly, something went wrong, I think, on the campaign. I mean, I think everyone sort of agrees with that. The question is whether or not getting rid of Andrew Scheer is going to fix that, and that may be the case. But I mean, I was thinking about this earlier today, and goodness, the Liberals really went through this for a few years. They cycled through Stéphane Dion, Michael Ignatieff before they settled on Justin Trudeau, and this was not a good period for them. It was a very unstable period. So I think there's a pretty solid argument to say let's tough it out with Andrew Scheer, see what happens, instead of going into another leadership race in what the last one was 2 years ago, not even that long ago.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see the politicians and the political parties going through a lot of turmoil. I mean, Trudeau went from a majority to a minority. The NDP lost 15 seats, so none of them were sitting pretty, really, right? And if you replace the leader right away, it's kind of like a hockey team keeps replacing the coach every year. At one point in time, do you say, okay, maybe it's not the coach, it's the players?
Yeah, isn't that the truth? I'm a fan, I think, generally of sort of unstable politics because I'm a skeptic of professional politicians, and I think there is benefit to new blood being in the room. But at the same time, I mean, there is a strategy to these things. You need the trust of your grassroots, you need the trust of your members of parliament, and that changeover happening quick. That's risky business. I mean, the NDP really tried this with Jagmeet Singh. They had a new, young, charismatic leader, was liked in Ontario politics. And he's had a lot of trouble at the head of that party for almost no reason. So it's an odd thing. And I think the Tories probably want to be careful about making some mistakes that their fellow parties have made in the last few years.
It makes for some fun, interesting time for us journalists, doesn't it?
It does. It really does.
Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks a lot for joining me today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me on.